Hey there, everyone, and welcome to Economic Data Hub, the podcast where we dive into the heartbeat of the U.S. economy, talking real data, real people, and real stories. I'm your host, and today we're going to spend about 30 minutes unpacking a topic that's been front and center in our lives: inflation. We'll weave in some storytelling, share data trends on U.S. inflation, touch on U.S. GDP, and lay out what it all means for families, businesses, and future policy. I promise to keep it natural, like we're chatting over coffee, so let's jump right in. Picture a typical Monday morning in suburban Ohio. The Parker family, mom, dad, and 2 kids, sits down at the breakfast table. The cereal bowl clinks against the spoon, and Sarah Parker, mom, lets out a sigh. She's got the grocery receipt in hand, and last month's bill was already eye-popping. This time, it's up another 10%. Honey, these eggs were only $6 last month, she says, eyebrows raised. Now they're $7.50? Dad, Mike, shrugs. Welcome to 2025, Sarah. Prices just keep creeping up. The kids groan. They know Dad has to drive to work through rising gas prices. It's all tied together. What people pay at the pump, at the store, even the rent uptick. Those are the everyday ripples of inflation. And yet, at the same time the Parkers feel these pinch points, official data shows that overall inflation in the U.S. has been cooling off. How can both be true? That's exactly what we're unpacking today. Why our everyday experience sometimes seems at odds with the numbers, how economists track these changes, and what it means for our U.S. economy moving forward. First off, let's get on the same page about what we mean by inflation. In the simplest terms, inflation is the rate at which prices for goods and services rise, eroding purchasing power. If your favorite latte was $4 last year and now it's $5, that's a 25% increase in price. Classic inflation, right? But economists don't look only at lattes. 2 of the main gauges are the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, and the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, or PCE. CPI tracks a fixed basket of goods, think groceries, rent, transportation, while PCE is Fed preferred because it accounts for how people shift what they buy when prices change. In other words, if beef gets pricier, some of us might pivot to chicken, and PCE reflects that choice more dynamically. By April 2025, the headline CPI had ticked up by about 2.3% over the previous 12 months, and core CPI, which strips out food and energy, was up roughly 2.8%. Meanwhile, PCE clocked in at around 2.1%, and core PCE hovered near 2.5%. All of those figures are much closer to the Fed's 2% long-time target than they were a couple of years back when we were seeing 8%, 9%, even double-digit jumps in early 2022. So why does it feel we're still being squeezed? 2 big reasons. First, core inflation, that's prices outside energy and food, has remained stickier, meaning rent, medical care, used cars, services have kept climbing. And second, our personal experience carries price memory. When prices shot up rapidly during the pandemic recovery, we formed a mental benchmark. Groceries costed way less before. Even when the pace of increase slows, we still feel like everything's more expensive than it was 2 years ago. Let me tell you about Alex Turner, who owns a small café in Nashville. Back in 2021, when business picked up after lockdowns, Alex was thrilled. People wanted to get out, grab coffee, catch up with neighbors. But then he noticed his supply chain invoices creeping upward. Flour, sugar, milk, up 20% each in 6 months. By mid-2022, he was paying nearly twice what he did in early 2021 for the same shipments. Alex had a couple of choices: raise menu prices or absorb the cost. He tried splitting the difference, smaller price increases, leaner recipes. But by late 2023, even his wholesale coffee bean supplier was adding a tariff surcharge, blaming lingering supply chain disruptions. Fast forward to April 2025, Alex reports his wholesale costs have stabilized, even declined a bit when energy prices dropped. The CPI numbers bear that out. Overall energy component in CPI was down about 3.7% year over year, and gasoline dropped roughly 11.8%. Yet, Alex still can't lower his latte price to pre-pandemic levels. Why? Because his rents went up, his labor costs are higher. Workers know they can command better wages, which trickles back into his menu. So Alex's story captures how the headline, "Inflation is cooling," doesn't automatically translate into cheaper coffee or groceries at home. Let's dig a bit deeper into the numbers, keeping in mind Alex's story and the Parker's kitchen table. Here's how the data break down. Headline CPI plus 2.3% over the past year as of April 2025. This was the smallest 12-month uptick since February 2021. Core CPI, ex-food, ex-energy, plus 2.8% over the past year, with a monthly increase of about 0.2% in April. PCE, plus 2.1% year over year, the Fed's preferred gauge, with core PCE at plus 2.5%. Energy and food. Energy costs dropped 3.7% year over year. Gatecrashers back home cheered at the gas pump. But food at home, groceries, still saw a 2.8% rise on the year, though that slowed from prior months. Now, we also want to see how the annual trend has evolved over the last 5 years. From 2020 through April 2025, here's a quick rundown. 2020, average annual CPI was roughly 1.2%, the pandemic year. Prices tumbled in early lockdowns. 2021, CPI surged to about 4.7% average, supply constraints, pent-up demand. 2022 skyrocketed to around 8.0%, peak of the post-COVID plus geopolitical shocks. 2023 moderated to roughly 4.1%. Fed's aggressive rate hikes kicked in. 2024 further cooled to about 2.9% on average. 2025, Jan to April, year-to-date CPI averaged near 2.7%, with April alone at 2.3%. The trajectory tells us something important. From an all-time spike in 2022, inflation is easing significantly. The question is how lasting this is. Core services, rent, medical care, transportation are still rising around 3 to 4%. That suggests the Fed might not let up too soon. On the other side, we need to touch on U.S. GDP. How fast are we growing, and how does that interact with inflation? Real GDP growth slowed to about 2% annualized in Q1 2025, down from a brisk 3.2% in Q4 2024. Business investment is flattening, but consumer spending remains relatively strong even as savings drip lower. A slower GDP pace helps the Fed feel more comfortable about controlling inflation. If GDP growth were sizzling at 4% while inflation sat at 2%, the Fed might worry about overheating. Instead, with GDP growth moderating, they can more confidently hold or even cut interest rates when the data confirms sustainable 2% inflation. All right, now let's peel back the curtain on what the Federal Reserve is thinking. They've got a dual mandate: keep inflation at or near 2% and aim for maximum employment. So far, we've seen unemployment running around 4.2% in April 2025. That's very close to what many Fed economists would call full employment, or the natural rate. Earlier this year, Fed officials debated whether to continue their stubbornly high interest rate policy or start easing. Markets priced in a couple of quarter-point cuts around September 2025, but the Fed's minutes from May showed a cautious stance. Quote, "We want to see a few more signs of inflation persistence easing, notably in core services." In essence, they're saying, we see progress, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Now, throw in trade tariffs and supply chain uncertainty. Officials worry that renewed tariffs, especially on certain Chinese imports, could jam up prices again. Imagine a company like Best Buy or Walmart suddenly passing on a 10% tariff on electronics. That might stoke inflation anew. Hence, Fed signals that risk is tilted toward letting inflation reaccelerate if external shocks crop up. But let's zoom out. The Fed's inflation forecasts from March 2025 suggests PCE stays around 2.7% for 2025, declines to 2.2% in 2026, and finally lands at 2% by 2027. So they envision a gradual return to their target. Remember our café friend Alex? Even if headline inflation hits 2.3% by April, core pressures keep his costs elevated. That's why Fed wants to see core under control. That's where fundamentals really lie. Let's hop over to Iowa, to a small dairy farm owned by the Martinez family. Every spring, Jose Martinez plants feed corn, plans his milk production, and calculates how much it costs to keep the barns warm through winter. Last year, his propane bills doubled. Hay costs shot up because drought hit feed supplies in the West. On top of that, trucking rates were up. Operators charged more to haul milk to processing plants. So by mid-2022, Jose was losing money. He had to borrow at higher interest rates to cover operating costs. Come spring 2025, Jose sees the bright side. Energy costs moderated. Propane is down 20% from its mid-2022 peak. But hay remains roughly 10% more expensive than it was pre-pandemic. His input costs are still above past norms. Meanwhile, the price he gets for a gallon of milk remains relatively flat compared to 2022. The chain reaction is clear. He can't pass along the full cost to consumers because the milk market is competitive. He's squeezed, just like Alex in Nashville, just like the Parkers at the breakfast table. Stories like Jose's spread downstream. Higher dairy input costs lead to slightly pricier cheese, yogurt, milk at the grocery store. That's baked into CPI's food-at-home component, which was still up nearly 2.8% year-over-year in April 2025. So when Sarah Parker wonders why her $4 gallon is now $4.50, Jose's reality is part of the answer. His production costs are still elevated, even if inflation headline rates are cooling. So why do families like the Parkers feel gouged even when CPI numbers are trending toward the Fed's 2% goal? It comes down to perception and memory. As consumers, we tend to remember the highest price we've recently paid and compare every new price to that. We keep mental tabs. I recall eggs being $2 less just 6 months ago. Even if eggs settle back a bit, the floor is still higher than pre-2021. Also, there's a lag in how quickly price declines show in official statistics. If energy prices fall sharply today, it may take a month or two before most retailers pass along discounts. Plus, landlords and contract service providers, like healthcare, are slow to adjust. Rent categories in CPI hover around a 4% annual increase because lease agreements often lock in for a year. So if rent jumped 5% in June 2024, you're stuck paying that price until lease renewal in June 2025, even if rent indices cool by then. In a sense, your lived experience trails the data by several months. That's why consumer sentiment can remain sour, even if economists point to good news in the numbers. According to University of Michigan surveys, consumers' one-year inflation expectations were around 6.6% in May 2025, despite actual CPI near 2.3%. That disconnect amplifies worry. If people think inflation will be 6% next year, they behave differently, spending today rather than saving, negotiating higher wages, sometimes fueling the very price pressures they fear. Let's widen the lens to the U.S. economy as a whole. How does inflation interact with U.S. GDP? In Q1 2025, real GDP growth was roughly 2.0 to 2.2%, down from the 3 to 3.5% range in late 2023-2024. Consumer spending remains resilient, think holiday travel, dining out, streaming subscriptions. Yet business investment in equipment and software has slowed as firms grapple with the prospect of higher borrowing costs. Residential construction is soft too because mortgage rates are higher than last year's lows. Now, slower GDP does two things. It reduces upward pressure on demand, which helps choke off inflation, but it also risks tipping us into a growth slowdown or even a mild recession if demand falls too fast. The Fed is walking a tightrope. Tighten too much, and GDP dips to 0% or negative. Loosen too soon, and inflation could reignite. Remember that 5-year inflation trend we talked about? After hitting roughly 8% in 2022, we're now near 2.3% in April 2025. GDP growth dipped from above 3% to around 2%. Takeaway. The U.S. economy is cooling off from an overheated posture, but not sliding into recession. Unemployment holds near 4.2%. Wage gains have moderated to around 4% year over year. There's still good news here. Jobs are available, wages are rising, and growth is modestly positive. That combo suggests a soft landing is possible. So here's the big question. What's next? Will we see inflation dip below 2%? Will GDP growth pick up or keep slowing? A few things to watch. Core services inflation, especially rent and healthcare costs. If those cool further, the Fed can feel confident cutting rates. Right now, core services sit near 3 to 4%. Trade policy. Any new tariffs or supply chain disruptions could jolt prices upward again. Tariffs on certain imports are still causing firms to pass costs on to consumer goods. Wage growth. If wages keep outpacing productivity gains, businesses will raise prices to protect profit margins. We've seen wages growing around 4%, which is okay if productivity can rise too. Global economic conditions. A slowdown in China or a new shock in Europe could spare U.S. inflation by damping commodity prices, but it could also hit U.S. GDP by hurting exports. For families, businesses, and everyday Americans, the key takeaway is this. Keep an eye on your personal budget, because headline inflation isn't the whole story. Look at mortgage rates, local rents, healthcare premiums, and grocery staples. That's where the costs land. As we wrap up today's episode, let's circle back to the Parkers. Sarah and Mike sit down next month and realize that although the grocery bill is still higher than pre-pandemic, they're not seeing 10% to 15% monthly jumps anymore. They're seeing 0 to 1% increases. That's progress. And Alex in Nashville will thank you with the possibility of a lower wholesale coffee bean price, though he still won't be cutting latte prices to 2021 levels. Jose in Iowa will be relieved by lower propane costs, even if hay remains a bit pricey. And as for our broader U.S. economy, we're looking at a trajectory that points towards stabilization. Inflation closer to 2%, GDP growing softly, and unemployment still low. Thanks for joining me on Economic Echoes. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend who's scratching their head over why their paycheck isn't stretching as far as it used to. We'll be back next week to dive into another slice of the American economic story, maybe digging into the housing market or the jobless claims puzzle. Until then, take care of your wallet, your family, and each other. I'm Jamie Carter. Stay curious, stay informed, and keep echoing those economic insights into your daily lives. See you next time.